Welcome to the infamous edition of the Headstones and Microphones, where we use AI to step into the past through a researched first-person simulation done through creative storytelling of history's most infamous people. Now, let's meet our guest. Welcome to the podcast. Let's start at the absolute beginning, where the public narrative hasn't yet distorted who you were. When and where were you born, and what was your given name?
I was born on June 7, 1940, down in Reynolds, Georgia. My given name back then was Samuel McDowell.
What was your hometown and home life like as a child?
Well, I didn't stay in Georgia too long. My mother was very young, a teenager, and she wasn't around much. I ended up being raised mostly by my grandmother, and we moved up north to Lorain, Ohio. Life was pretty tough and unstable. We moved around quite a bit, and I always had a hard time fitting in or doing well in school.
Was there a story behind your name, or a nickname that stuck with you?
Most people ended up knowing me as Samuel Little, taking my regular last name. But when the law caught up with me, they gave me some pretty dark labels. In the streets, some people just called me Mr. Sam. Later on, the media and the investigators started calling me the choke and stroke killer because of the specific way I committed my crimes.
What were you like as a child, and how many years of schooling did you actually attend?
I was a troubled kid, always struggling to keep up. I didn't make it all the way through high school. I had a lot of behavioral issues early on, and by the time I was in my mid-teens, I was already getting pulled out of the regular school system because of my actions.
Was there a specific moment when you realized you were fundamentally different from everyone else?
It started incredibly early for me, way before anyone else noticed. I remember having a bizarre fixation on women's necks when I was only about 5 years old. By the time I was 7 or 8, those thoughts turned into a dark desire to actually choke and kill. When I was 15, I started looking at true crime magazines that showed women being strangled, and it just fueled what was already inside me.
What's a decision that changed everything for you, but felt small at the time?
It was just getting into the habit of stealing and realizing I could get away with things. I started taking what wasn't mine, and that minor thrill completely replaced any desire I had to live a normal, straight life. It set me on a path of just wandering and taking whatever I wanted.
Let's talk about your early run-ins with the law. Before the world knew your name for your most infamous actions, what was your very first arrest or interaction with law enforcement, and what were the consequences?
My very first arrest happened when I was only 13 years old back in Ohio, and it was for theft. A few years later, in 1956, I was caught breaking and entering out in Omaha, Nebraska. Because I was still a juvenile, they held me in an institution for young offenders. On my booking card, they wrote down that my mother's whereabouts were completely unknown.
At what moment did you realize your name would never be forgotten?
For decades, I slipped under the radar completely, but everything broke wide open after I was arrested at a homeless shelter in Kentucky in 2012 and sent to California. By 2014, they used DNA to convict me, but the real explosion happened a few years later in 2018. That's when I started talking to a Texas Ranger named James Holland. When the FBI realized the sheer number of cases I was accurately confessing to, it became a national media frenzy. That was the moment the world knew I'd be recorded as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history.
Did fame make you more dangerous, or did it simply expose who you already were?
The notoriety didn't happen until I was already an old man behind bars, so it didn't change my actions. The truth is, the wandering lifestyle I lived for decades just exposed the monster I always was. I used to be a competitive boxer, and I used that physical strength to deliver a knockout punch to my victims before strangling them. I targeted people society often overlooked, like prostitutes and drug addicts, which kept me hidden in plain sight for 40 years.
Who do you believe betrayed you first? A person, society, or your own instincts?
I can't blame anyone else or say an accomplice turned on me because I operated entirely alone. If anything, it was modern science that finally caught up with me. My own belief that I was completely invisible and could never be caught is what kept me leaving tiny traces of evidence behind. And decades later, the DNA technology finally advanced enough to expose me.
What was your most unique habit or a random fact about you that would surprise people?
People are always shocked to find out that I had a photographic memory and was a very talented artist. While I was confessing to those dozens of murders in prison, I sat there with art supplies and drew more than 30 highly detailed, colored portraits of my victims entirely from memory, even remembering exactly what they wore and how they did their hair decades earlier.
What did the public never understand about the pressure you were under at the time?
When I was on trial back in 2014, I screamed out and insisted I was completely innocent. The public saw a cold man, but inside custody, I was constantly calculating. I spent decades traveling across 19 different states, always moving, always changing locations to keep the pressure of local police forces off my back.
Did you have any known rivalries that defined your career?
My main adversary at the very end was Texas Ranger James Holland. He was the one who finally broke through my defenses. He sat with me for 48 straight days in a room, keeping me supplied with pizza and Dr. Pepper, playing into my ego until I spilled every single detail of what I had done across the country.
What personal battles were you fighting privately while the world was watching?
While I was out there traveling and committing crimes, I was constantly dealing with my own criminal lifestyle, getting busted for DUIs, shoplifting, fraud, and assault. Later in prison, my health was failing rapidly. I was wheelchair bound and dealing with diabetes and heart issues while the investigators were trying to get my final confessions.
What was your darkest moment, and was there ever a time you wanted to walk away from it all?
My darkest moments were the close calls where I almost got caught early on. I was actually arrested and put on trial for murdering a woman named Patricia Ann Mount in Florida back in the early 1980s. I managed to get acquitted and walk away from that trial. Instead of stopping, that narrow escape just made me feel completely invincible, and I immediately went right back to doing it again.
What truth was hardest to escape when you were alone at night?
When I was alone, I didn't feel remorse the way regular people do. The truth I couldn't escape was the exact faces of the women I had killed. Because of my photographic memory, I could see them clearly in my mind, where I met them, how I disposed of their bodies in dumpsters, alleys, or abandoned buildings. They stayed with me visually until the day I died.
When the law finally closed in, how exactly were you brought to justice? Walk me through the final arrest, the charges that ultimately stuck, and the legal outcome of your trials.
In September 2012, they tracked me down at a wayside Christian homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. Initially, it was just on a narcotics charge from Los Angeles, but once they extradited me to California, LAPD detectives matched my DNA to 3 unsolved murders from the late 1980s: Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. In September 2014, I was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. Later on, after I started confessing, I received even more life sentences in Texas and Ohio as they verified at least 50 of my 93 confessions.
What's the craziest rumor ever told about you, and what part of your story has been exaggerated the most?
Because many of my victims were troubled or had drugs in their systems, their original autopsies were often ruled as accidental overdoses or natural causes. The craziest misconception was that these women just slipped away on their own. The reality wasn't an accident or an exaggeration. I forcefully suffocated them with my bare hands, often leaving the bones in their throats completely intact so the coroners wouldn't suspect foul play.
What is the biggest misconception people have about your life?
People look at the total number of victims and assume I must have been some criminal mastermind who planned out elaborate schemes. The truth is much more mundane. I was just a transient, drifting from state to state, exploiting the gaps in the legal system and targeting vulnerable people because I knew the police wouldn't investigate their disappearances very thoroughly at the time.
What would surprise people most about your ordinary human side?
Aside from my artwork, people are always surprised by how ordinary and soft-spoken I could appear in everyday life. I lived with my mother in Florida for a time in the late 60s, and to regular people on the street, I just seemed like an older, friendly guy who liked to talk, eat junk food, and draw pictures.
When, where, and how did you pass away?
I passed away on December 30th, 2020, at a hospital in Los Angeles County while I was serving out my life sentences at the California State Prison. I was 80 years old, and my health had just completely given out from natural complications.
Was your downfall caused more by your own flaws or by the world changing around you?
It was definitely the world changing around me. I got away with my crimes for decades because police departments in different states didn't talk to each other, and there was no central database to track a traveling killer. Once DNA testing and computerized criminal databases became the standard, the world became too small for me to hide in anymore.
What past regrets did you carry with you to the end? If you could erase one decision from your life, would you, or was it necessary to become who you were?
In my final days, I didn't express regret for the lives I took. I viewed my actions as a dark necessity of my own nature. If I had any regret, it was simply getting caught and losing the freedom to live my life on the open road.
What scared you more? Getting caught, losing power, or being forgotten?
Losing my physical power and freedom is what truly broken me at the end. Being stuck in a wheelchair, confined to a prison cell, and dependent on guards was far worse to me than being caught. I certainly wasn't afraid of being forgotten. I knew exactly what my legacy would be.
When you look back now, do you see yourself as the villain, the hero, or something in between?
I knew exactly what I was. I didn't see myself as a hero, but I also didn't look at myself with the hatred that the world has for me. I saw myself as someone driven by a dark, inescapable compulsion that I chose to feed for 50 years.
Do you have any closing remarks about the interview or the stories you shared that you would like to share with the listeners before signing off?
Just that the drawings I left behind are the only real monuments those women have. I took their lives, but I kept their faces alive in my mind until my very last breath. Let the world remember the details I gave, because every single one of those stories was real.
And that wraps up another conversation from Beyond the Grave. Thanks for joining us on the Headstones and Microphones podcast. Remember, do better with the life you have been given and choose to do good in this life. Please help spread the word by sharing and following the pod.